Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of Skeptic Bible Study. Is this book I'm holding in my hand a historical document? Now, many skeptics and freethinkers, myself included, laugh at that very idea. But as difficult as it may be for us to understand this, there are a lot of Christians out there who regard this not merely as a book of theology, but in fact a historical document filled with eyewitness accounts that are reliable and that can tell us about real events that actually took place. It reminds me a bit of that movie about this alien culture that watches this Earth TV show and thinks that it's a set of historical documents and they base their whole society upon it. Ridiculous as it may seem, there are people who believe it. So the best way I think to debunk this is to take a look at the history that the Bible offers of the world and compare and contrast it with the history that we know and see how much of it can be verified. Now let's begin at the so-called beginning. Adam and Eve are created in the Garden of Eden. Now, according to chapter 2 of Genesis, this is somewhere in the Middle East, and we know this because it references the Euphrates River. However, if we go according to anthropology, the human race got started in Africa and spread to the rest of the world from there. Also, biblical literalists will say that this took place about 6,000 years ago, such as Archbishop Usher in his analysis. Now, 6,000 years would mean that the world was created roughly 2,500 years after the Greeks developed agriculture and 2,000 years after the Thais developed rice. So some young Earth creationists kind of realize that that's not possible, so they stretch the envelope a little bit. They say that the world was created as early as 10,000 years ago, which means that that would be about 2,000 years after the last ice age started to come to an end. Moving on, we go to Noah's Ark. Now, someone requested that I do a video on the topic of Noah's Ark and why that's ridiculous, and my response was that would be a great topic for a doctoral thesis on any number of scientific fields to really do that any justice. Now, one link I have is off to the side here. Talk Origins has some good resources on all of the problems with Noah's Ark and why it's not only unlikely, it's absolute, the story is completely impossible. After Noah's Ark, we have the Tower of Babel story, which is the biblical explanation as to why there are so many languages in the world. And link off to the side shows my video on why this is the most ridiculous story in the Bible. Moving on to the next book of Exodus, we have the unlikely Jewish-Egyptian population growth. They go from 70 to over 1 million in just 4 generations. And I document that in a video off to the side there. Essentially, every single female of childbearing age would have to be constantly pregnant with twins, with no infant mortality. Eventually, Moses tells the Pharaoh to let my people go, and he brings down all manner of plagues upon the Egyptian people. And these are overtly supernatural in nature, ranging from the Nile River being turned to blood to every firstborn Egyptian in every household being simultaneously killed in one night. There is absolutely no historical record that this took place. Nor can archaeologists find any evidence for Moses' subsequent journey with over 1 million Hebrews through the Sinai desert. Eventually they cut a swath of destruction to the Promised Land, and the empire of David and Solomon was established. An empire so glorious that there is not one shred of evidence that it ever existed. I heard one historian speculate that perhaps there was a historical David who was a hill chieftain at the time or some sort of a bandit chieftain. So perhaps that's all just a gross exaggeration, but regardless, it's not a reliable historical piece of evidence. Next, we move on to the New Testament. The descendants of David eventually led to Jesus. Now, this would either be 28 generations if you go by Matthew, or 32 generations if you include the 4 generations in 1 Chronicles that was omitted by Matthew, or 43 generations if you're going by Luke. Now, Jesus was born either before 4 BCE or after 6 AD, depending on whether you're going by what Matthew's account was or Luke's account. I have a video off to the side that talks about this. Wise men come to seek Jesus. These 3 wise men are following a star, which if you actually tried to do that, you'd be going around in circles. Maybe that's why they needed to stop and ask directions from Herod the Great. Herod the Great has all the infants around the area of Jerusalem killed, an atrocity that is not recorded in history, despite the fact that both Philo and Josephus no fans of Herod the Great documented all of his atrocities. Not one shred of evidence that it took place. Then comes Jesus' ministry. According to Luke, he's a child prodigy, and at the age of 12, he's teaching in the temple, except that Matthew and Mark say that he didn't begin his ministry until after John the Baptist was put into prison, which according to Luke happened when Jesus was around the age of 30. Now, John contradicts Matthew and Mark by saying that, in fact, Jesus did have a ministry going. He says in somewhere in the middle of John, the Gospel of John, chapter 3, that John the Baptist had not yet been put into prison, and Jesus already had had his temple tantrum and had talked with Nicodemus. So apparently Jesus did have a ministry, except that he didn't, according to Matthew and Mark. Finally, at the end of his ministry, he's crucified, he's resurrected, and he's taken up into heaven. If you go by Mark and Luke, this happened on the day of his resurrection. If you go by the Gospel of John, Jesus has his whole story with doubting Thomas, and after 8 days ascends into heaven. And if you go by Acts, which theoretically is written by the same Luke who said that Jesus arose into heaven on the day of his resurrection, Acts says in chapter 1 that Jesus stayed around on earth for 40 days preaching his gospel message. So clearly none of these supposed eyewitnesses could get their story straight. But how reliable are they? Well, I've already done one video on the topic of Matthew and why he's a liar. Then in chapter 9 of both Mark's Gospel and Luke's Gospel, in verse 38 according to Mark and verse 49 according to Luke, there is a man who is not affiliated with Jesus' movement who is casting out demons and performing healing magic. And the disciples were asking Jesus what to do about this. So the question I have is, do you believe that mortal human beings, not Jesus, not angels, not even people who are following Jesus, regular mortals can perform this kind of healing magic and cast out demons, and for that matter, that demonic possession is responsible for illness? If you don't think so, then it's clear that either Mark and Luke were liars or they were crazy because they believed it. Acts has similar supernatural accounts. In Acts chapter 2, verse 1 to 14, it documents how the apostles were speaking in tongues after having been filled with the Holy Spirit. And this does not mean that they were writhing around on the ground speaking gibberish. I'm talking about speaking foreign languages coherently. And other people who spoke those foreign languages as native tongues could actually understand them and hear their own language being spoken to them. Do you think that this kind of magic is possible? What about casting out demons and exorcism? Philip performs this in Acts chapter 8, verse 7. Paul strikes a mage blind in chapter 13, verse 11. And there are numerous accounts of healing magic being performed, my favorite of which is Acts chapter 19, verse 12, where Paul's magic handkerchiefs are able to heal the sick and cast out demons. No, I'm not making that up. So it's clear here that these Christians, the kind of which are depicted in Jesus Camp and other movies, where they believe in all of this exorcism and speaking in tongues and all of these supernatural things, they're not crazy. They've read the Bible and they really do believe that the universe operates this way. If you do not believe that the universe operates this way, then clearly these eyewitness accounts that asserted to the contrary are either crazy or they were liars. So they are not reliable eyewitness accounts. Finally, we come to the Gospel of John. Now, the Gospel of John is clearly more advanced in its theology than the Synoptic Gospels, in that it starts to propose the early versions of the Trinity, this idea that Jesus was God incarnate. But even John can't get this story straight. In chapter 10, verse 30, the Gospel of John says Jesus saying that I and my Father are one. And yet, if you read the same Gospel in chapter 14, verse 28, Jesus says, my Father is greater than I. So which is it? Is Jesus God or is Jesus not God? So John contradicts himself on what has to be a very important theological issue, and therefore he's not a reliable eyewitness account either. So clearly this book is a book of mythology. Christians, get over it. May God's gift of reason light our way.